Imagine a country sitting on the largest oil reserves on Earth, where gasoline used to be cheaper than drinking water. Now imagine that in that very place, people once carried sacks of cash to the market, not to show off wealth, but because it was the only way to buy a loaf of bread. Venezuela did not collapse with bombs. It broke into pieces, very slowly, inside everyday life. In short news clips, Venezuela is often told as an economic disaster or a long political crisis. But the numbers, about inflation, sanctions, or power, do not show you what it feels like to live here. The feeling of waking up every morning and not knowing whether today's salary still has value. The feeling of watching cash turn into waste paper faster than any promise from the government. The feeling of having to relearn how to survive in a country that was once seen as wealthy. What makes Venezuela hard to understand is the contradictions that exist side by side. On one side are poor neighborhoods where electricity and water are unstable, and people must struggle day by day. On the other side are roads shining with lights, luxury restaurants, expensive cars, and a class of people who still live as if the crisis is only a story on TV. Those two worlds are only a few streets apart, but they seem to belong to two different realities. And then there is the question many Americans have never had to face directly. What happens when a country bets its entire future on a single resource? When the system breaks, who pays the price first? The government, the elite, or ordinary people standing in line outside the market? The story of Venezuela is not only the story of a faraway country. It is a quiet warning about how fragile stability is, about how a society can change faster than we think. And to understand that, we must look at real life behind the headlines, where people are still trying to keep going, day by day, in a reality no one chose in advance. To understand why Venezuela could fall into a crisis this deep, we have to go back to the point that was once seen as this country's greatest advantage: oil. For decades, oil was not only the main source of revenue, but also the foundation of Venezuela's entire economic and political structure. When oil money flowed into the state budget, it created the feeling that wealth was automatic, that growth would always continue, and that other problems could be solved later. But that dependence planted the seeds of fragility. Venezuela's oil is not the kind that is easy to extract or easy to refine. It is heavy, thick, and demands high technology and high costs. In the years when oil prices were high, this problem was covered up by the flood of money. The state spent aggressively. Subsidies spread everywhere. The government machine expanded, and an economy was built around consumption instead of diverse production. When money comes easily, questions about efficiency and sustainability are rarely asked. The fragility became clear when global oil prices shifted and management capacity did not keep up. Revenue fell, but spending did not fall at the same pace. To cover the deficit, the government chose to print more money. At first, the impact was not too obvious, but over time, trust in the national currency weakened. When trust disappears, money is no longer a measure of value, it becomes an obstacle to exchange. Hyperinflation did not arrive overnight. It entered daily life, step by step. Prices rose faster than wages. Wages rose slower than prices. Then came the moment when even if wages increased, it no longer mattered. People carried more money each time they went to the market. Not because they were getting richer, but because money was losing value too fast. Images of sacks of cash, money used for crafts or toys, were not exaggerations. They were the direct result of a monetary system that had lost its most basic function. In that context, Venezuelan society was forced to adjust itself. When money was no longer reliable, people turned to other ways to trade. The US dollar became common in major transactions, even if unofficial. Goods, services, and personal relationships gradually replaced the role of cash. An electrician, a friend who works in a store, or a relative abroad became more valuable than any banknote. But an economic crisis does not exist in a vacuum. It brings deep political and social consequences. When hardship lasts, people's patience is worn down. Protests, instability, and polarization grow. In response, the authorities tighten control. strengthen power, and try to maintain order with tougher measures. This spiral makes trust between the state and society fall even further. One of the clearest impacts of the crisis is the wave of migration. Millions of Venezuelans left the country in the peak years, carrying not only luggage, but also memories of a homeland that once promised so much. For those who stayed, life became a constant problem of coping. They learned how to live with unstable electricity and water, with a health system in shortage, with days when finding enough food was already a challenge, and yet, Venezuela is not completely sunk in darkness. Alongside hardship are parts of life that are rebuilding themselves. Small markets, street businesses, and unofficial initiatives have grown. People use every chance to earn income, even small ones. That flexibility shows another face of the crisis. When the official system no longer works effectively, society finds ways to organize again from the bottom up. What surprises many outsiders is that some areas still keep a look of wealth and relative stability. Clean streets, luxury restaurants, and modern shopping centers have not completely disappeared. They exist beside poor neighborhoods lacking basic needs, creating a sharp contrast in the same city. This gap is not only about income. It is a split in the ability to access resources, from foreign currency to basic services. From a broader view, Venezuela's story is not only about weak management or wrong policies. It is a clear example of the risk of placing an entire economy on a single pillar, especially when that pillar is tightly tied to global swings. When oil prices are high, everything looks stable. When oil prices fall, problems long hidden rise up all at once. For Venezuelans, those macro analyses explain only part of it. What they face every day is a very specific question. What can I buy today? Will there be electricity tomorrow? Will there be enough money for the family next month? In those small questions, the crisis becomes the most real, the closest, and the hardest to escape. Venezuela today is the result of many layers of causes stacked together. Abundant resources, but fragile governance. Big ambition, but limited ability to execute. Trust once existed, then slowly disappeared. And when trust leaves, what remains is a society forced to learn how to live in conditions no one wanted, but no one can avoid. When the crisis is no longer breaking news, but becomes the permanent background, life in Venezuela moves into another stage. It is no longer a sudden collapse, but a long state of survival under instability. Cities keep functioning, but they function under a new logic, where everything is adjusted to fit a reality that has changed at the root. Morning in Caracas does not begin with the familiar rush of a big city, but with testing the situation. People open the door and look outside, checking whether there is electricity today, whether water is running, whether public transport is operating normally. Those questions repeat every day and become part of the rhythm of life. When basic services are no longer guaranteed, a day that passes without a major problem is already seen as a lucky day. The streets are still crowded, but the way people do business has changed. Small shops grow everywhere, using any space they can, selling food, fixing phones, exchanging money, transferring money. Everything happens on sidewalks, in temporary stalls, or right in front of homes. The informal economy becomes the main bloodstream of city life. For many families, income does not come from one fixed job, but from many small sources stitched together. A person can be an office worker in the daytime, a seller at night, and do extra work on weekends to cover what is missing. Public transport still exists, but it is no longer reliable like before. The subway and buses are often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and run unpredictably. People learn to be flexible, leave home earlier, and build in extra time for breakdowns with no warning. Going to work or school is not only movement. It is a chain of calculations to avoid risk and save costs. Security is a topic that is always present in conversations, not in a panicked way, but as something to keep in mind. People know which areas to avoid at night, what time to go home, and how to dress so they do not attract unnecessary attention. This caution does not freeze life, but it creates a layer of silent tension. Every action comes with consideration, and freedom in public space is shaped by survival experience. In that context, the spread of the US dollar changes city life significantly. Even without full recognition, the dollar becomes a common unit in many transactions. Stores that accept dollars often have more stable supply and clearer prices. This creates a new dividing line in society. Those who can access foreign currency have more choices. Those who cannot must keep coping inside a far less stable system. Rich and poor neighborhoods therefore become clearly different. In some areas, luxury restaurants, modern cafes, and shopping malls still operate, serving a small class that can afford them. Just a few streets away, other neighborhoods struggle with long blackouts, lack of water, and limited health services. Two worlds exist in parallel, with little overlap, but they depend on each other in ways that are not easy to see. Family becomes the most important support in Venezuelan life today. When social institutions weaken, networks of family and friends step in. People with salaries send money to those without jobs. People with electricity share with neighbors who do not have it. These relationships are not only material support, they also help keep a sense of community alive. In a long crisis, isolation is as dangerous as material shortage. Another major change is how people think about the future. Long-term plans become rare. Instead, people think short-term, focused on getting through this week, this month. For many young people, the question is no longer what to do in 10 years, but whether they should leave the country. For those who stay, building a stable life means accepting a much higher level of uncertainty than before. Still, life is not only gray. Culture, music, and community activities remain, even if simpler. Small gatherings, local festivals, and religious life help people find a sense of normal. In those moments, the crisis steps back, making room for a basic human need to connect and to feel that you belong somewhere. Venezuela's reality today, therefore, cannot be packed into one word. It is both decline and reconstruction, a society running under huge pressure, yet still finding ways to keep its rhythm. Cities do not collapse, they shrink, adapt, and continue to exist under new rules. And in that process of adaptation, people show most clearly their endurance, flexibility, and creativity when placed in a situation no one wanted, but must face every day. If urban life shows how Venezuela operates under crisis, then the rich-poor divide reveals the social price of a system that stays broken for too long. By moving only a few kilometers in the same city, a person can go from a world of shortage to a world that seems untouched by the crisis. This contrast is not loud, and it does not need signs, but it appears in very small details. In wealthy areas, stores still open regularly, restaurants serve full menus, and generators make sure the lights never go out. Buildings are tightly guarded, cars move in and out in order, and basic services stay stable. Life here is not without worry, but the worries are more about management than survival. Prices rise, but people can still pay. Power cuts happen, but there are backup plans. Uncertainty exists, but it is cushioned by resources. Completely opposite are poor neighborhoods, where the crisis is present in every daily activity. Electricity can be gone for hours, even days. Clean water becomes a resource that must be stored. Keeping food fresh becomes a hard problem when refrigerators do not run steadily. For many families, meals depend not only on income, but also on whether there is power that day, whether there is water. Life here runs on waiting and improvising. The gap between these two worlds is not only money, it is a difference in access to choices. The rich have many options when crisis hits. The poor have very few. When the official system no longer guarantees basic needs, those with private resources protect themselves first. Those without must accept greater risk, for longer. And more often, this divide deeply shapes how people see society. The sense of injustice does not come from the fact that some people are rich, but from the fact that wealth exists alongside extreme shortage in the same space. When two worlds live next to each other but do not touch, social trust is worn down. The poor feel abandoned, the rich feel threatened. Social cohesion, the glue of a society, becomes more fragile than ever. In that context, the role of women becomes especially clear. When traditional family income is no longer enough, many women become the new economic backbone. They sell on the street, open small stands in front of the house, offer beauty services, cook to order, or work in the informal sector. These jobs do not bring long-term stability, but they help families survive day by day. For them, work is not only earning money, it is keeping the family from falling into despair, but that flexibility also comes with major risks. The informal economy has no insurance, no contracts, no safety net. When health declines or the market shifts, income can disappear instantly. Women, therefore, are both a symbol of adaptation and the most vulnerable group in a long crisis. They carry more, but they are protected less. The rich-poor divide also reshapes public space. Wealthy areas are protected more and more tightly, while shared public spaces in poor areas decline quickly. Parks, schools, and public hospitals face huge pressure and lack resources. This creates a hard loop to break. When shared space weakens, chances to escape poverty drop. Children who grow up in shortage have fewer chances to reach quality education, and therefore struggle to break the cycle of poverty. What is notable is that even with the divide, these two worlds still depend on each other. Service labor, delivery work, security, domestic work, and small trade connect them in ways that are often overlooked. The rich need the labor of the poor to maintain their lifestyle. The poor need the cash flow from the rich to survive. This dependence does not create equality, but it shows that a fragmented society has not completely snapped apart. Psychologically, a long crisis creates a kind of collective fatigue. Not loud panic, but quiet exhaustion. When everything gets worse slowly, people gradually adjust their expectations downward. Things once seen as basic rights become luxury goals. That acceptance helps society keep running, but it also blurs the line between what is unacceptable and what has become normal. In that picture, Venezuela appears not only as a country in crisis, but as a harsh social laboratory. It shows what happens when an economic and political system fails to distribute risk fairly. Those with resources protect themselves, those without carry most of the consequences. And between them is a society trying to keep itself from fully falling apart. Understanding this divide is the key to understanding Venezuela today. Not to judge, but to see clearly that crisis is not measured only by economic numbers. It is measured by how unequal the ability to survive is across groups. And that gap is the deepest crack any society must face when its shared protection system is no longer strong enough. If the earlier parts show how Venezuela's economic and social structure has been distorted, this part goes deeper into the human factor, not through statistics, but through how people change behavior, thinking, and relationships to survive in long instability. When crisis is no longer temporary but becomes the new normal, people are forced to redefine what an acceptable life even means. One of the clearest changes is how Venezuelans see the value of work. In the past, a stable job with fixed pay and benefits was a common goal. Now, many such jobs no longer cover basic needs. A monthly salary can be less than what someone earns in a few days of small trading or freelance service. This completely flips the old social order, where degrees and official positions once gave status and relative safety. Now, flexibility and the ability to hustle become the most important assets. People learn to combine many roles at the same time. A teacher may teach during the day, sell food at night, and take side jobs on weekends. An office worker may also exchange money, repair things, or deliver goods. These jobs do not bring stability or social prestige, but they help a family get through each month. Gradually, the idea of a career no longer stays tied to personal identity. It becomes simply a tool for survival. This shift also strongly affects social relationships. In shortage, networks become more important than ever. People with relatives abroad are seen as having a big advantage, not only because of remittances, but because of access to information and opportunity. Relationships that used to be social become matters of survival. Who knows who? Who can help who? becomes more practical than long-term plans. Family therefore takes the central role. Many generations live under one roof to share costs and resources. Responsibilities are rearranged. The young support the old financially. The old care for children so working-age adults can take extra work. The family structure becomes more flexible, but also carries more pressure. Every small shock, illness, loss of income, can affect the whole support system. A long crisis also changes how people think about ethics and personal choices. Behaviors once seen as unacceptable, informal trading, avoiding rules, gradually become normalized. When laws no longer protect basic life, many people feel strict compliance no longer makes practical sense. This does not necessarily come from moral decay, but from survival logic in an unsafe environment. Still, this adaptation does not happen without a psychological cost. Long uncertainty creates chronic stress. Many people live in constant worry, even if they look calm on the outside. Being unable to plan long-term reduces the feeling of control over life. Hope does not disappear completely, but it becomes more cautious, tied to very small and close goals. In that context, the role of women continues to stand out, not only as earners, but as emotional managers of the household. When men lose jobs or see income collapse, women often carry the added responsibility of keeping children and relatives emotionally stable. They become anchors in families under heavy pressure, even while they themselves face risk and exhaustion. Venezuelan youth face especially hard choices. Many see leaving the country as the only path to a clearer future, but leaving also means separation from his family and carrying guilt for those left behind. For those who choose to stay, building a meaningful life requires accepting a level of uncertainty that earlier generations rarely had to face. All these changes show something important. Crisis does not only destroy economic and political structures, it reshapes people from the inside. It forces them to adjust values, expectations, and how they see themselves. A society can continue under hardship, but their cost is not only material, it is the slow erosion of safety, trust in the future, and the norms once seen as the foundation. Venezuela today, therefore, is not only a story about oil or policy. It is a story about people placed in conditions that force constant adaptation, where survival becomes the main measure of success. And in that process of adaptation, larger questions about society, fairness, and the responsibility of systems toward people appear more clearly than ever. As the story moves toward its end, what must be looked back on is not shocking details or extreme images, but the deeper meaning Venezuela leaves to the world. After years of crisis, the country is no longer only an example of an economy that collapsed. It becomes a living reminder of how big systems directly shape human life. What happened in Venezuela did not happen in a vacuum. It is the result of choices accumulated over time, where each decision that seemed reasonable in the short term helped create long-term consequences that are hard to reverse quickly. One of the clearest lessons is the danger of placing a nation's entire fate on a single resource. When oil brings fast wealth, it also weakens the drive to build other parts of the economy. Diversity is neglected. When shock comes, there is no cushion thick enough to absorb the impact. This is not only Venezuela's problem. Many other countries, rich or poor, have faced similar risks when they rely too heavily on one economic pillar. Alongside that is the role of trust. An economic system can survive mistakes for a time, but it is very hard to recover when trust is broken. In Venezuela, when people stopped trusting the currency and the institutions meant to protect them, society was forced to operate outside the official system. Those alternatives keep life going, but they also further weaken the shared foundation. This is a vicious cycle, where every act of personal adaptation makes the collective system more fragile. Venezuela also shows the difference between stability on paper and stability in real life. A government can keep power, cities can keep running, stores can stay open, but if basic life for the people is not secured, that stability is only the surface. Under it is accumulated fatigue, shrinking expectations, and the feeling that the future is no longer something you can clearly imagine. When a society lives too long in that state, Deep psychological and cultural shifts become unavoidable from an international view. Especially in the United States, Venezuela is often seen through the lens of ideology or political conflict. But real life is far more complex. Most people do not live to represent a model or an argument. They live to feed their families, to keep dignity, to hold on to a sense of normal in an uncertain world. When these stories are reduced to slogans, we lose the chance to understand more deeply how people respond to long crises. What stands out is that despite countless hardships, Venezuelan society has not completely fallen apart. Community, family, and religion act like soft pillars that keep people from total isolation. This solidarity does not solve structural problems, but it reduces the destructive impact on each person. In the hardest times, these connections keep society functioning, even in a distorted shape. Still, we should not romanticize endurance. Human resilience is impressive, but it is not a long-term solution. When a society must constantly rely on personal improvisation to cover system failures, the burden falls more and more on the most vulnerable. Women, children, and the elderly often pay the highest price, even though their contribution to social stability is huge. Looking ahead, the big question for Venezuela is not only when the economy will recover, but how society will recover. Can trust be rebuilt or not? Will those who left return or not? And what values will the generations raised in crisis carry when they step into roles that shape the country? These questions have no simple answers, but they will decide the nation's long-term direction. At the same time, no recovery can happen without trust. Trust cannot be forced. It is built through consistency, transparency, and accountability. When people see that rules apply to everyone, that personal effort matters, and that the future is not decided entirely by forces out of reach, society can begin to heal. Venezuela's story should not be remembered as an example used to score points between political models. It should be remembered as a warning about how economic, political, and moral decisions weave together in real life. When a society trades long-term sustainability for short-term stability, the cost often does not appear immediately. It comes slowly, but deeply, and spreads far beyond early predictions. As we close this part, what matters is not that you reach one simple moral judgment, but that you keep the ability to reflect. Venezuela is not only the story of one country. It is a mirror of the risks, choices, and limits that any society can face. Understanding that is the first step towards seeing the world with more caution and humanity. Instead of only through short headlines and rushed conclusions, the final part of this journey is not meant to close Venezuela's story with a neat conclusion. Instead, it opens a space for the listener to ask questions of themselves. Because if we only see Venezuela as an exception, a faraway disaster, we will miss the most important thing this story offers. Venezuela did not collapse in a single moment. It slid downward in silence, through decisions that seemed reasonable at each time, until the price became too great to reverse quickly. What makes Venezuela unique is not the level of crisis, but the speed at which people were forced to adapt to losing things that used to be taken for granted. A society can endure a lot before it pushes back. People can adjust expectations, shrink dreams, and accept new limits if it helps them keep living. But that very endurance also raises a worrying question. When does adaptation become surrender? And when that happens, what does a society still have left to recover with? Venezuela shows that stability is not only about economic growth or political power. It is the feeling of safety in daily life. It is the trust that tomorrow will not be worse than today. When that feeling disappears, every reform effort must stand on a social foundation that has already been worn down. People no longer wait for big promises. They wait for small but concrete changes, enough to believe the system still has the ability to correct itself. For audiences in the United States, Venezuela is often placed inside ideological debates. But if we put political labels aside, what remains is a universal lesson about how fragile modern systems are. No country is immune to accumulated mistakes. No economy can stand forever if risks are ignored for too long. And no society can keep cohesion if the sense of fairness disappears. Venezuela also raises questions about shared responsibility. The responsibility of the state to build strong institutions. The responsibility of elites not to separate themselves from the reality of the majority. And the responsibility of the international community when it intervenes in a country in crisis. Decisions made from far away can bring strategic gain, but their consequences are often carried by people who have no voice in making them. Looking forward, Venezuela's future is still an unknown. Recovery, if it happens, will not be fast and will not be even. Social cracks formed in crisis can take many years, even generations, to heal. Young people raised in instability carry a different value system, more cautious, more practical, and less trusting of promises. This can be an obstacle to rebuilding, but it can also be the foundation of a more clear-eyed society. If guided in the right direction, still, no recovery is possible without trust. Trust cannot be demanded. It is built from consistency, transparency, and accountability. When people see that rules apply to everyone, that personal effort has meaning, and that the future is not decided entirely by forces beyond reach, society can begin the process of healing. So Venezuela's story should not be remembered as a case to compare which political model wins. It should be remembered as a warning about how economic, political, and ethical decisions intertwine in real life. When a society trades long-term strength for short-term stability, the price usually does not show up right away. It comes slowly, but deep, and spreads wider than expected. As this journey ends, what matters most is not what conclusion you reach about Venezuela. What matters is what conclusion you reach about how modern societies work, and about the role of each person in holding up or challenging those systems. Because in a world that is more tightly connected, what happens in one country today can become a lesson for many other countries tomorrow. Venezuela is not only the story of a country that took the wrong path, it is the story of the limits of people, of systems, and of trust. And looking directly at those limits, rather than turning away or simplifying them, is the first step to avoiding similar mistakes in the future.